The first scout sneezed at a pine cone, and the second one got shot in the leg. That was the moment things stopped being funny for the Galactic Recon Unit. Up until then, they were laughing at Earth. Their mission logs even labeled the planet as a Class C primitive reserve, barely above microbial interest. The unit's captain had snorted when he read the assignment. Earth. A mud ball with trees. Maybe they'd spot some rusted satellites or angry goats. He told his squad to treat it like a nature walk. But now there was blood on the leaves, and all 6 eyes of the injured scout were blinking in disbelief as he clutched his thigh and screamed. They had landed their shuttle on the edge of what the humans called a national forest. It stretched for miles across untouched wilderness, a patch of thick pine, oak, and underbrush that satellites rarely passed over. The Galactic Council had flagged it for inspection due to anomalous energy readings and rumors of human resistance fighters hiding tech there. The captain had laughed that off. Humans hiding anything valuable in a forest was like squirrels stashing gold. As they marched in formation, their high-tech suits shimmered with adaptive camouflage. They glided over roots and rocks, sensors pinging in lazy patterns. The first few hours were peaceful, even boring. They mocked the birds that swooped overhead. One scout mimicked a squirrel and nearly fell out of a tree trying to catch one. They made jokes in their native clicks and growls about how humans must live in these trees like bugs. They even started taking samples of dirt, scoffing at how the planet still used organic farming. The trouble started when their gear began misbehaving. Their scanners, designed to pick up even the heat signatures of insects, began blipping in and out. Their comms fizzled with static, as if the air itself refused to cooperate. Still, the captain dismissed it all. He told them to press forward. If anything, this backwater planet was resisting out of stubbornness. He gave an order to spread out and scan a half-mile radius for any hidden outposts. Then came the sneeze. One of the younger scouts, who had been complaining about Earth's pollen, triggered his internal filtration system with a sneeze that echoed across the forest. A second later, something snapped. A sharp whistling cut through the trees, and a long, thin object pierced the scout beside him. It buried itself deep in the upper thigh, sending the alien to the ground with a scream that rang through the woods. Panic erupted. They activated shields, dropped low, and scanned in every direction. But there was no enemy in sight. Just trees. Endless, silent trees. The captain shouted for a scan sweep but got no response from the nearest scout. That one had gone silent. The others were too distracted to notice he never even screamed. Another arrow came next, this time embedding itself in the bark of a tree just inches from the captain's head. Attached to it was a strip of paper with a crude human drawing. It showed a figure with a bow and the words written in sloppy black ink, "You are not welcome." The captain tore the note off and hissed. This was now an ambush. A human ambush. But how? How had a primitive creature pierced their adaptive armor and evaded all their tech? He barked orders to regroup, form a circular perimeter, and activate thermal overlays. The overlays worked, for about 6 seconds. Then the screens went blank, overexposed by an unnatural heat bloom coming from somewhere below the forest floor. One scout swore he saw eyes in the trees before his screen died. The youngest scout began to mutter to himself. He was from a system where forests were myth, his people living on sterile glass plains. He'd only read about trees. He didn't like the way they seemed to breathe when you weren't looking. He whispered that something was wrong with the air. That it felt like they were being watched. Another snap. Another arrow. This one hit a branch, knocking it down right in front of a scout's path, tripping him. When he scrambled up, his HUD blinked red, multiple targets, all around, moving fast. But there was nothing visible. Suddenly, their leader's wrist communicator sparked and died. No more link to the shuttle. The trees had cut them off. They tried to move. One by one, each step was met with more traps. A wire snagged a leg. A spike hidden under leaves punctured a boot. Someone fell into a pit. The forest was not just watching. It was hunting. Still, the captain refused to retreat. He declared that they would capture the human, dissect him if needed, and send his remains back to HQ as a warning. That arrogance lasted less than 2 minutes before another arrow whizzed through the air and shattered his shoulder plate. They ran. Not tactically, not in a formation. They scattered like children in a haunted maze. Behind them, the bowstring whispered again. At dusk, they regrouped under a low ridge, panting, bleeding, and confused. One scout suggested calling in an airstrike to level the forest. But the captain, now visibly shaken and nursing a seared wound, muttered that he didn't even know where to target. The enemy wasn't in a bunker. He was the entire forest. They slept in shifts, though none truly slept. Strange sounds kept them half awake, snapping twigs, crunching leaves, a flute playing faintly somewhere in the distance. The youngest scout cried quietly into his chest plate. He wanted to go home. He no longer cared about Earth or its strange dirt. He just wanted to stop feeling like a mouse in a trap someone else had set. The captain looked at the crude arrow that had nearly taken his eye and realized something for the first time in his military career. They were not explorers here. They were trespassers. And something far older than technology, far colder than logic, had just put them on its list. Elias Trent hadn't spoken to another human in 6 years, and he liked it that way. The forest didn't ask questions. It didn't care about your past, your medals, or your regrets. It only respected patience, discipline, and silence. That's why he lived there, tucked deep into the folds of wilderness where even maps gave up. His cabin, if you could call it that, was camouflaged with moss and bark. A small fire pit remained hidden under a canopy of rocks, and he hunted only with bow and trap, never leaving signs of modern activity. His tools were relics sharpened by hand, not power. His boots were stitched from old deer hide, and his bow, Mercy, was crafted from wood passed down through his grandfather's line. It was not technology that protected Elias. It was knowledge, earned over decades, layered in scars and calluses. He noticed the disturbance 3 days earlier. The air pressure had changed, like the sky was holding its breath. Birds shifted patterns. A fox that usually passed his trail at dawn never showed. Then the clouds rolled oddly, unnaturally smooth, moving against the wind. That's when Elias knew someone, or something, had landed. And they weren't hikers. They moved too clean, too confident. He had watched them from the cover of a cedar tree, 100 feet up, face streaked with charcoal, breathing with the wind. Their suits shimmered like heat haze, blending with the forest but not enough. Not to him. He'd seen ghosts move quieter in war zones. He counted 6 of them. Tall, broad, heavy-footed. Not human but close. Arrogant in their stance. They didn't belong. He didn't need their language to understand their attitude. They laughed at birds, kicked at roots, and tried to scan a world they didn't respect. They moved like tourists. Elias moved like the dirt. While they tripped sensors and bragged to each other, he set traps. Nothing too lethal, just enough to get their attention. A spring trap that triggered a dead branch to fall. A tripwire that would rip their cloaks. A pit lined with soft mud and crawling things that wouldn't kill, just confuse. He wanted to see how they responded when the forest bit back. By the time the second arrow flew, Elias had already mapped their path. He knew which one was the leader, the one who barked orders with a flick of his wrist. The others followed but never looked him in the eye. Subordinates, probably. Maybe conscripts. The youngest moved jittery, always scanning. Elias decided to spare that one. He looked scared enough to learn. The others, though, needed a lesson. He wasn't just protecting trees. This forest was federal ground, marked decades ago after strange energy readings had surfaced. What the scouts didn't know was that the zone was classified to red. Restricted, not because of what was under it, but because of who had been stationed around it. Elias had once trained there, back when he worked for a branch of the military that didn't officially exist. They called his unit the Whisper Dogs. Not because they barked. Because they didn't. They were trained to move without being seen, to eliminate without sound, and to survive where satellites couldn't reach. Elias had taught younger soldiers how to disappear into brush, how to track by shadow, how to read the wind like a script. When his time ended, he left the service, but the forest stayed with him. It was his blood now. And anyone who disrespected it, they earned what came next. The traps weren't about revenge. They were about warning. He wanted the scouts to feel pressure, to feel unwelcome. He left signs, not because he had to, but because he chose to give them a chance. The crude drawing on the arrow wasn't a joke. It was a gift. The words were a mercy they didn't deserve. But they didn't take the hint. They pressed forward, armed and irritated, scanning like it mattered. That was when he triggered the real traps. The smoke canisters were homemade, crafted from crushed pine, sulfur, and old military powder. When the scouts tried to set up camp, Elias waited until dusk, then launched the canisters from a ridge above them. Green smoke bloomed over their camp like a slow-moving fog, reacting with their scanners to trigger false readings. They scrambled in confusion, shooting at shadows. Elias didn't laugh. He watched with cold patience, noting how they retreated in the wrong direction, deeper into the forest, toward the high gulch where he kept his oldest snares. By the time they realized they were off course, it was too late. One stepped into a trip loop and was yanked sideways into a pile of leaves that concealed a shallow pit. The other shouted. He let them rescue him, allowed panic to bloom. Then he struck again, just enough to drop a tree limb behind them with a jarring crack. They turned and fired wildly, wasting energy, revealing weakness. He didn't need weapons. Their fear was ammunition. Elias moved silently through the canopy, always above them, watching. At one point, he crept within 10 feet of their resting position, breathing in sync with the breeze. One of the scouts was eating something from a pouch. Elias wrinkled his nose at the smell, processed protein with synthetic additives. He whispered to himself, almost mournfully, that they couldn't even eat real food. Then he vanished back into the treetops. He knew they would call for extraction soon. That was the moment he waited for. He wanted them to summon their ship. He wanted them to bring more eyes, more noise, more arrogance. Because when they did, he'd show them the mistake they made. This wasn't just wilderness. This was the last place on Earth where ancient law still ruled. Where the forest could still kill you with silence. As he watched them stumble toward a clearing, one of them stopped, panting. He looked around, his 6 eyes scanning uselessly. Elias could tell the scout was about to break. And then it happened. The young one dropped to his knees and whispered something that Elias couldn't understand, but the sound of it was desperation. The others ignored him, but Elias didn't. He saw the fear, the moment of understanding in the boy's posture. That one would live, if he was smart. Elias leaned back against the tree and ran a hand along his bowstring. It was still tight. Still ready? Mercy didn't speak unless she had to. But tonight she might have something to say. Not out of hatred. Out of duty. Because the forest wasn't just his home. It was his country. And these invaders had trespassed on sacred ground. The wind shifted. He caught a trace of heat from an incoming ship. They had made the call. The next phase had begun. Elias stood slowly, eyes narrowing. He wasn't preparing for war. War had already started. Now came the answer. The ship appeared just past dawn, low and slow, humming through the treetops like it owned the sky. Its underbelly shimmered with reflective shielding, casting a ripple of distorted air over the branches. The remaining scouts looked up as if salvation had arrived. One of them raised both arms and shouted into his wrist link, voice cracked and desperate. But they didn't notice the clearing they stood in was too clean, too symmetrical, and too quiet. Birds that normally nested there were gone. The ground was dry in a pattern that didn't match the weather. The trees around it leaned unnaturally outward, like they had seen something terrible and were still trying to flee from it. Elias watched from the edge of the tree-line, crouched behind a stack of rotting logs, the remote detonator loose in his hand. He didn't blink. He waited. As the transport lowered its landing gear, its scanners lit up with false positives. Heat signatures appeared scattered through the woods, mimicking retreating scout movements. Motion alerts pinged randomly as if wild animals were converging on the spot. The pilot hesitated and engaged a hovering hold. That moment of hesitation saved them from full destruction. Elias didn't want to kill the pilot. Not unless they insisted. His traps were meant for warning, not war. But he couldn't allow that ship to touch down. Not on his forest floor. Not after everything. He pressed the trigger. A thunderclap ripped through the clearing. The soil erupted with dirt, smoke, and shards of metal. One of the ship's landing gears bent under the blast, tilting the transport at an awkward angle. Its thrusters screamed and fought for balance, hovering with difficulty. The scouts scattered again, shrieking over each other. One dropped his rifle and ran without direction, crashing into the underbrush. Another tried to shoot blindly into the smoke, his blasts hitting nothing but old tree trunks. Elias let the chaos spin. Let it build. Then he moved. He crossed from one tree to another in complete silence, closing the distance on the disoriented group. He didn't draw his bow yet. Not until he was sure who was still leading. The scout who had once commanded them was now on his knees, coughing and shaking. The younger one was trying to pull him up, panic in every gesture. Elias almost admired the loyalty, but not enough to spare the rest. The scout who had mocked the forest the loudest, the one who had kicked at birds and joked about fur-wearing humans, was now limping toward a ridge, his face pale and streaked with soil. Elias had marked him earlier. That one didn't respect anything. Not even survival. He stepped in front of him without a word. The scout froze. His eyes went wide, all six of them locking on to Elias, who stood with shoulders squared and mercy lowered at his side. The scout raised his hands slowly. He tried to speak, but Elias just looked at him, long and hard, and then turned and walked away. The message was clear. You leave. Now. Behind them, the damaged ship groaned and pulled upward, wobbling toward the clouds. They weren't retreating. They were reporting. Elias had made himself known. They would talk about him. They'd call him a threat, a hazard, maybe a security concern. He didn't care. What mattered now was that they understood the truth. This place was not unguarded. Somewhere above, Orbit Command received the alert. A Galactic officer reviewed the feed with growing concern. On screen was a still image taken from a scout's helmet just before the visual feed cut out. It showed a figure in natural camouflage, holding a handmade bow, staring directly into the lens. Behind him stood a wooden sign nailed to a tree. It read Federal Preserve Do Not Enter. Another smaller sign below it had been freshly hammered in place. It said Lethal Force Authorized. An emergency meeting was called. A historian among the Galactic Council whispered a term into the room. Ghost Stalker. A code name flagged decades ago in a planetary defense file buried so deep most had never heard of it. The record described a survivalist named Elias Trent, believed dead after disappearing during his final mission. The file noted that he had trained counter-invasion tactics in terrain that closely matched this forest. No record of retirement. No funeral. Just one last note in the file. Terminated in the field. Presumed lost. And yet now he stood, alive and lethal. Back in the forest, Elias retrieved the arrow he had fired earlier. He wiped the shaft clean and tucked it back into his quiver. He preferred not to waste materials. Every arrow was made with time and care. The steel was reclaimed from old fencing, the fletching from wild turkey feathers. He returned to his cabin, where he began rechecking the perimeter traps. He moved slowly, deliberately, checking each trip line, each snare, each pressure sensor disguised beneath moss and pine. He worked like a man fixing a fence, not a warrior preparing for battle. But his mind was calculating distances, times, angles. He knew they'd come back. They always did. The next day, the forest remained still. Elias set out deeper toward the valley where the river cut through a ravine. It was the most remote part of the land, and it held something the scouts hadn't found yet. An old war cache, buried during his last mission, sealed beneath stone and root. Inside were more traps, more tools, and one device he hoped he'd never need. It wasn't a weapon exactly. It was a signal flare encoded with a message designed to reach an old satellite system buried behind outdated encryption. A beacon from the Ghost Network. A way to call back those like him, should Earth ever be marked for violation again. He dug it up slowly, brushing dirt away like a priest uncovering an artifact. The casing was intact. He didn't activate it. Not yet. But just touching it reminded him that he wasn't the only one who had made a promise to this land. There were others. Maybe still alive. Maybe just waiting for a reason to wake up. By sunset, Elias was back at his watchpost. He sat beneath a crooked pine, eyes half-lidded, breathing slow. The wind carried the scent of foreign oil. They would try again. They always did. But this time, maybe they'd remember. This wasn't just a forest. This wasn't just Earth. This was a place guarded by silence, sharpened by time, and defended by a man whose entire purpose had been boiled down to one idea. They do not pass. As the shadows stretched across the trees, Elias notched another arrow and whispered to the forest. Just one word. Ready. The stars over Earth glinted with cold indifference as a second, larger transport ship broke orbit. This one was not a scout vessel. It was a response craft, heavier, bristling with armor, carrying a full tactical unit. Inside the ship, the commanding officer, a veteran named Raxon, studied the broken footage from the earlier team. The reports were contradictory, chaotic, and half-finished. Multiple units disabled. Primary scanners corrupted. One wounded. One missing. One dead. And the only visual that survived was a grainy image of a man with a bow standing in a forest like something pulled from ancient myth. The council had not laughed. They had ordered the site reclassified. Raxon's orders were simple. Investigate. Subdue. Capture the asset if possible. Neutralize if not. Raxon had led campaigns on volcanic moons, toxic swamps, and cities choked by rebellion. He did not fear planets. Especially not one full of dirt and trees. As the ship descended, he briefed his team in a low, steady voice. Primitive terrain. Human insurgent. Possibly enhanced. Likely rogue. Do not underestimate. But his tone lacked true concern. He had seen far worse than some lone earthbound relic with wood and arrows. Or so he thought. The ship landed 2 ridgelines away from the site of the previous ambush. Raxon chose a new approach, avoiding the clearing that had been rigged. He deployed 3 scout pairs with full tactical surveillance, acoustic sensors, and drone coverage. He did not expect resistance, only information. The team moved fast, slicing through the woods in overlapping arcs. They found no bodies, no camps, no obvious signs of struggle. Just trees, silence, and scattered signs of movement. Broken twigs. Shifted leaves. The kind of evidence that would mean nothing on most planets. But to Elias, it was as loud as a war horn. From high in the trees, Elias watched them descend with the patience of a hunter. These weren't like the first group. They were precise. Measured. Too careful for bait traps or smoke tricks. He would need to wait. So he vanished again, slipping into the deeper wilds, guiding them one layer at a time into ground he had prepared years ago. The riverbank would come first, then the cliffs. And if they were still standing after that, the deep brush where the ground itself misled even the best trackers. It began with a sound. Not loud, not sudden. Just a subtle ripple in the air, like something slipping past too fast to see. One of the scouts stopped mid-step and whispered into his mic that he heard something. His partner laughed, and told him it was probably a falling squirrel. Then the rope cinched around his ankle and dragged him 10 feet backward into a hollow bush, slamming him against the base of a tree. His partner turned and opened fire, but there was nothing there. No target. Just shadows and pine. They regrouped, more cautious now, advancing in tight formation. Elias left signs. Not footprints. Symbols. Old marks used in survival training that none of them recognized. Circles in tree bark. Knotted twine left dangling. A broken compass buried upright in a stump. Psychological warfare. He didn't need to outgun them. He needed them to start doubting their surroundings. Back at the ship, Raxon reviewed the signs and dismissed them. He authorized controlled fire to clear the undergrowth and flush out the ghost. The team began setting charges along the outer tree lines. The flames were slow and methodical. They thought it was clever. But they didn't realize the wind would turn. Elias had spent the morning preparing a barrier trench. The fire bent along the wind line and pushed straight back toward them. Not fast, but enough to create a wall of smoke, breaking their line of sight and forcing them to separate. That was when Elias struck. He moved through the smoke like it was water. The first scout went down with a pressure dart to the throat. Non-lethal, but enough to knock him out for hours. The second got strung upside down in a snare and left swaying 10 feet above the ground. The third was pinned with an arrow that nailed his armor to a tree, trapping him but not piercing skin. Each time, Elias left something behind. A feather. A notch in the bark. A silence too deep. Raxon watched the feed collapse. 4 down. 2 unresponsive. 3 remaining. He called in his heavy unit. No more recon. No more caution. He wanted a perimeter burned out, and the asset captured within the hour. They brought in suppressive fire drones and began clearing the forest edge with energy pulses. Trees fell. Birds scattered. The forest groaned in response. But Elias had already moved further inward, pulling them into his last trap. The gulch. They followed him across narrow ground, unaware of how much the earth had been softened beneath them. Years ago, Elias had rerouted an underground stream through a narrow channel. With a single lever pulled from behind a log, he released it. The ground shifted, dipped, and cracked. 2 soldiers fell into the mud and vanished waist deep. A third slipped and dropped his weapon into the water. From the ridge above, Elias stood with his bow drawn, mercy angled at Raxon's helmet. The arrow would not kill him. Not yet. But it would end the mission. He let it fly. The shaft whistled past Raxon's cheek, cutting his calm line. Raxon flinched, then stared upward at the man above him. Elias didn't speak. He simply turned and walked away. Back aboard the ship, Raxon gave the order to retreat. He didn't justify it. He didn't argue. He just said one line. The forest belongs to him. The ship rose into the sky, silent and damaged. They left behind broken equipment, wounded soldiers, and no clear footage of their target. Only scattered images. A man with a bow. A war-trained ghost. A reminder. That night, Elias returned to his cabin. He cooked a small meal, fed the dog that watched the trees from the porch, and cleaned his arrows one by one. He sat by the fire and listened to the woods settle again. No flames. No buzz of drones. Just the creak of branches and the sigh of wind. In a nearby tree, he had carved a small mark. The same one he had used during his last classified mission. A half-circle with 3 dots beneath. It meant ready, watching, unseen. The stars above spun on, unaware. But down below, in the shadows of pine and stone, one man kept his promise. This land will not be taken. Not without a fight. In the farthest arm of the Galactic Council's communication grid, word was spreading. Not through official channels, but in whispers. At outposts and border stations, at refueling hubs and between patrol shifts, stories were beginning to take root. Most started the same way. A scout team went missing on Earth. A second team barely made it back. A third was ordered to stand down before they ever launched. None of that would have mattered if not for the image. It had been pulled from a corrupted helmet feed, salvaged by a technician who knew better than to erase things too quickly. That image traveled faster than orders did. A man stood in the forest, unmoving, carved from bark and shadow. A bow in one hand, a look in his eye that said leave and do not come back. The caption beneath it, added by someone who had never set foot on Earth, read only one thing. The wilds are not empty. They started calling him the Ghost of Pines. Others preferred Earth's Reaper. But the name that stuck was one pulled from an old human archive, misunderstood and misused. The stalker of still ground. What mattered wasn't the accuracy. What mattered was the effect. The next 3 scheduled missions to Earth's surface were quietly reassigned. A research team tasked with mineral scans rerouted to Jupiter's moons. A diplomatic delegation was given sudden clearance delays. No one wanted to say why. But everyone knew. Something down there was awake. And it was not forgiving. Back on Earth, the forest had returned to its rhythm. The birds sang again. The foxes resumed their paths. The rivers cleared. But Elias remained vigilant. He walked the ridge lines each morning, sometimes barefoot, feeling the vibration of the earth beneath his heels. He listened for drone hums. He watched for strange clouds or unnatural wind. Nothing came. Not for days. Then weeks. But the silence did not mean surrender. It meant study. Observation. They would come again. But next time, they would not come in arrogance. They would come in force. Elias wasn't worried. He had time. And in time, he could prepare more than traps. He could prepare messages. He began carving notches into trees in patterns meant for the few who might still understand them. Old signals. Military short code. If anyone from the Ghost Network was still alive, still watching, they would see it. He did not expect help. He only wanted others to know that Earth was still defended. That someone had stayed behind. That someone had kept the oath. He cleaned his bow twice a day now. Not because it needed it, but because the ritual helped him think. Mercy had never let him down. He adjusted the fletching on a new set of arrows and dipped their tips in a special mix he made from crushed berries, salt, and resin. Non-lethal but paralytic. He had no desire to kill unless forced. He wanted them to fear the forest, not mourn it. One morning, a hawk landed on a post outside his cabin. It carried something unusual. A strip of metal tied with vine. Elias approached it slowly. The hawk did not flee. He took the strip and turned it in his fingers. There were symbols etched into it, alien ones. But below that, in shaky English, were 4 words. "We saw you fight." Elias looked to the sky. He didn't smile. But his jaw tightened with something like satisfaction. Someone out there understood. Maybe it was a scout who had survived. Maybe someone aboard the orbiting ship. Maybe even a traitor within the council who had always suspected Earth wasn't as helpless as it seemed. It didn't matter. The forest had been heard. He returned to his patrols. Deeper now. He reactivated old passageways he had sealed years ago. Small tunnels carved through roots and rock. Places too narrow for machines but perfect for a single human to move unseen. He checked old caches. Buried gear. Emergency flares coded to call for airburst support if things turned ugly. Some of the tech still worked. Other parts he repaired by hand. He wasn't preparing for an invasion. He was preparing for an understanding. One way or another, the message would spread. Earth was not unguarded. It never had been. News continued to ripple across the stars. Mercenary clans turned down escort contracts to Earth. Pirate vessels began updating their charts to include the forests as off-limits zones. One black market database flagged the Appalachian Range with a single red line and the phrase "approach only with funeral plans." A galactic tribunal met to discuss Earth's growing reputation. A minor voice suggested deploying a containment force. The room went silent. Then someone read aloud a witness report from the survivor of the 2nd Scout Team. The line that shut down the entire discussion was simple. "He does not miss." Meanwhile, Elias stood on a cliff overlooking a valley choked with trees. He listened to the wind. It was calm today. Birds circled below. A deer moved through the brush, unafraid. Behind him, a wall of trophies lined his cabin's outer edge. Not skulls or weapons. Just pieces of tech. Helmets. Wrist links. Broken scanners. Drones stripped for parts and repurposed into wind chimes. Every piece a reminder. Every clang in the breeze another warning. One night, a flare bloomed silently on the horizon. Not from an alien ship. From a distant peak, too far for any hiker, too high for any casual traveler. Elias saw it. He watched it for several minutes. Then he turned and lit a fire of his own. Not big. Not flashy. But it burned in a pattern. 3 short bursts. A long one. Then 2 short. A code. A memory. A promise that he wasn't alone. By morning, the fire was gone, and the trail had grown colder. But Elias had what he needed. Proof. The network still breathed, scattered though it was. And maybe, just maybe, when the stars blinked the wrong way again, more would return. Until then, the forest was his. And he would keep it safe. At the far edge of the wilderness, on a stone untouched by machine, Elias carved his final message. Not for aliens. Not for soldiers. But for time itself. You are not the first. You will not be the last. But I will always be here. And then he vanished into the trees, bow slung over his shoulder, eyes forward, steps light as falling leaves. The forest closed behind him. Quiet. Watchful. Waiting.